All right, hi boys, we are going to continue looking at markets. So we've introduced what was the law of supply, we've looked at the supply curve, and you now know about all the different factors that may affect supply. What today's video is going to focus on is all about the movements along the supply curve. So we've done this, and now we're looking at the movements along and the shifts of the supply curve. Very, very similar to demand. So in a sense, learning this new work about supply should sort of refresh your memory on demand. Okay, so let's start by looking at movements along the supply curve. Now, just remember that just like in the demand curve, movements along the curve mean that the actual curve itself that I'm highlighting right now isn't actually moving. It stays put. You're only moving along different points on this same curve. And the only reason why that happens is a change in the price of the good or service. That's the only reason why that would happen. Now, we can have two things that occur here. We either have an expansion in supply and a contraction in supply. And it's really important that you use this terminology. Do not call it an increase in supply based on the price increasing. Or don't call it a decrease in supply based on the price decreasing. If the quantity is changing, you say that the quantity expands or the quantity contracts only when we look at changes based on price and movements along the curve. The only times that you use the terms increasing and decreasing for quantity supplied is when we have non-price factors, which is when we have shifts in the supply curve, which is what we'll be looking at later on. So you have to remember that terminology. It's really specifically important. So we're going to look at the different movements. So we're going to assume that we start at P1 and Q1 here. So we're right in the middle. Now, firstly, we might have an expansion of supply. And the reason that that will occur based on the law of supply is that as the price increases, suppliers are going to start increasing their supply. And we're going to assume ceteris paribus. There's nothing else that's going on. It's purely just the price that's changing. So an expansion of supply occurs when the price increases. So we have to see that the price goes from P1 here up to P3. The price has increased, and as a result of that, we have an expansion in supply from Q1 to Q3. And that's how you would describe an expansion of the supply curve. Or if you got a question that said, explain what would happen to supply if there was an increase in the price of good or service. That's exactly what you would say. You would say an increase in the price of good or service from P1 to P3 will cause an expansion of demand from Q1 to Q3. And you have to use those points when you're explaining it and have that graph in there. That will help you to get extra marks, especially in your extended responses. So this is shown by an upward movement. So we've now gone up this curve and our new point is there. Now, when we're looking at a contraction of supply, based on our law of supply, if the price goes down, then the supply goes down as well. So here we can say that we have a decrease in the price from P1 to P2 now. And as a result, we can see a contraction in supply from Q1 to Q2. And there's a contraction in supply because suppliers are not as motivated to supply the good or service because the price has gone down for it and they don't see many opportunities. And so we have a downward movement along the curve. See how we didn't use the terms increase or decrease when talking about quantity supplied and movements along the curve. You can say that the price goes up or down, the price increases or decreases, that's just a general term. But when we're looking at supply and the quantity supply, we only use the terms expansion and contraction. And once again, this whole scenario can only happen for movements along the curve. Our expansion is an upward movement and our contraction is a downward movement along the supply curve. Now, if we're starting to look at shifts of the supply curve, this is caused by anything other than the price of the good or service itself. So when you are looking at all the different factors that can influence supply, things like the price of substitutes or complements, because that's not the price of the good you're talking about in your diagram, it's the price of the complementary good or the substitute good, that's something other than price. So it's a non-price determinant. It could be something like climatic or seasonal factors. It could be changes in technology. A whole range of different things could be the reason for this. So we call these shifts rightward shifts or leftward shifts, and the terminology is an increase and decrease in supply. That's what we use when we're looking at something other than the price of the good or service itself. So now the different factors that I was talking about before, these are all the different things that can impact it. Alrighty, so we're going to look at the first movement of the supply curve, and that's an increase in supply. And remember that this is caused by a non-price factor. And for example, we might call it, we might use an example of seasonal changes that mean that we can increase supply. So maybe let's look at bananas. So we're looking at, it's summertime and lots of bananas can be supplied because they're in season. I don't even know if summer's when bananas are in season, whatever. Whenever the time is that bananas are in season, and that leads to an increase in supply. So there's two things that happen based on this non-price factor. Firstly, firms are willing and able to supply more of the product at each price level than before. So let's start at our initial point, which is P1, Q1 and S1, and we use the notation 1 comes before 2, so we're using all these 1 points to tell us where we're initially starting. So we're initially here on the first original supply curve. At P1 they're willing to supply Q1 bananas, but as a result of now that increase in season of bananas, we now see a whole shift of the supply curve to the right. So we're now at S2 in terms of our supply curve. So that now means that still at this price, they're now able to produce Q2 as a result. Now that's the first thing that happens. The second thing that happens is that firms are now willing to supply a given quantity at a lower price than before. So let's look at, for example, initially at Q1, they were willing to supply, let's just say 100 bananas at P1 of $10. Now, according to our new scenario on our S2 curve, they're now willing to supply 100 bananas at a lower price level. Maybe this is $5 per banana. So because of these seasonal factors, the non-price occurring factor, because of these seasonal factors, they're still willing to supply a significant amount, but they're actually willing to accept less money for it. And that makes sense because for bananas, they're going to go to waste if they don't get sold. So they're more likely happy to take a lower price for it to make sure that they're sold. And overall, because they can sell more overall and supply is increased overall, they're going to still make revenue and profits because there's so much more to sell. Alrighty, so we're now looking at a leftward shift, which is what we call a decrease in supply. Now, once again, just remembering that we're looking at non-price factors, and the example that we're going to look today is at some sort of seasonal factor that has caused a decrease in supply. So we're going to look at a seasonal decrease in bananas in this example. So because we have a seasonal change that it does not favor the growing of bananas, then we have a decrease in banana supply in the economy. So two things will then happen as a result. Firms are then willing and able to supply less of the product at each price level than before. And this is because of a non-price factor of the fact that the climate isn't good for growing this particular fruit. So we're going to look at what this looks like on the points. So we're starting off at S1 and Q1 and P1. So initially they could supply Q1 of bananas at P1, but because of this seasonal change, we now have a decrease overall of banana production, which means now that at that same price level, they can only produce Q2, which is less than Q1. It's going towards 0 here. So they're now producing less. The second thing that happens is firms and willing are to supply a given quantity at a higher price than before. And that makes perfect sense. when there's less bananas or they're not in season, or really for any fruit or vegetable that's not in season, it's more expensive. And the reason for that is because it's harder to actually grow the crop in this particular scenario. So when we're looking at supply in this situation, so let's look initially at S1, so our initial supply curve before the seasonal change happened. They were willing to supply Q2 at the lower price of P2. Now, all of a sudden, now, as a result of our new supply, this Q2 is now being supplied at the price of P1, which is that higher level of price. And that's because there's less supply of the bananas. And what are the factors that cause shifts in the supply curve? There's a range of them, and these pretty much follow along with the ones that you talked about in your guided lesson worksheet. So I'm not going to go through these. You can just pause the video here and read through them and then ask me any questions that you want. But these should be what you are actually including. Go back to your notes and see whether or not you've included the right sort of relationships, whether they'll cause increases or decreases. So use these in there and just double check your work from there.